Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to take complex source material and, well, pull out the really game-changing ideas. Today, we're diving into something huge, a real paradox of our modern lives. How did we humans become the planet's main evolutionary force? And what happens when our culture, clashes with our biology?
That's exactly it. That's the tension. Our sources really dig into this, looking at the friction between things we want culturally, like living super long lives, perfect health for everyone, tons of cheap food, and what evolution considers fit. So our mission today is to unpack how this works. We'll look at how we're sort of manipulating our own genes, and then how we're massively changing the evolution of everything else through farming and genetic tech.
Okay, let's start with that first paradox. It affects everyone listening, right?
Yeah.
We've changed the rules of natural selection with things like medicine, sanitation. We all want to live longer, healthier lives. But what's the evolutionary trade-off? What's the cost?
Well, the cost is essentially a biological get-out-of-jail-free card in a way. If you look back, early human life was incredibly short. Our sources point out that life expectancy was maybe 20 to 30 years, right up until the Middle Ages. Barely 1 in 10 people made it past 40.
Wow, yeah. But then, almost overnight, in evolutionary terms, it just skyrockets. You see this graph. Life expectancy around 40 years in 1850 in developed places. And today, we're talking high 70s, low 80s. It's a massive jump, thanks to, like you said, sanitation, food, medicine, all cultural stuff.
Exactly. And this cultural success gives us post-reproductive longevity. Now, natural selection mostly cares about you passing on your genes, right? Reproducing. So once you're past those peak reproductive years, the pressure from selection really drops off. It almost vanishes.
Okay, so if a disease, maybe heart disease or certain cancers or late onset diabetes, if they mostly kick in after you're, say, 50, selection doesn't really have a chance to weed out the genes that make you susceptible to them. We might treat the illness, cure it even, but the underlying genetic risk, it stays in the population.
That's the compromise. We accept that trade-off. But it's important to say, selection hasn't completely stopped. It's not like evolution is over for humans. Research actually shows it's still happening, and maybe even faster than before. Something like 7% or more of our genome has changed in the last 40,000 years.
Right, and the rate of change,
Yeah.
it apparently jumped like 100 times since we started farming. That's incredible. We need a really clear example of this, of selection still working on us.
Yeah, a great one is the Tibetan Plateau. People living there are at incredibly high altitudes, average 4,600 meters. That's a huge stress on the body, the low oxygen. It demands really rapid, strong adaptation.
And they've basically evolved ways to cope, right? Fine-tuning how their bodies use oxygen.
Precisely. They have 2 specific genes that selection has favored. They're common in Tibetans, rare elsewhere. One gene helps them sense and react better to low oxygen, the hypoxia. The other optimizes how they use energy, burning fuel more efficiently. It's proof positive selection is still shaping us when the pressure is high enough.
That's a really clear picture. But let's go back to the other side of the coin, the problems when culture removes that pressure. You mentioned genetic diseases.
Yes, the idea of genetic load. The numbers are pretty striking. In the U.S., maybe 20 to 25 out of every 1,000 births have significant abnormalities. And if you add in conditions that show up later, like muscular dystrophy, it doubles to about 6% of live births.
And this genetic load concept, it means that even people who seem perfectly healthy, phenotypically normal, we're all carrying, 1 to 8 potentially lethal alleles, hidden genetic issues?
That's the idea. Alleles that if you got 2 copies homozygous, it would cause severe disease or death. Right. So the big question is, why are they still around? Why haven't they been eliminated?
Okay, and there are competing ideas on this.
Yeah, 2 main hypotheses are often discussed. First, the Dobzhansky hypothesis. This argues that maybe these bad alleles actually give some kind of advantage, like hybrid vigor if you only carry 1 copy if you're heterozygous, a trade-off.
Okay, a hidden benefit. But then there's another view, Muller's hypothesis.
Right. Muller had a more, worrying perspective. He argued these genes offer no advantage at all. He thought their frequency is high simply because modern medicine is shielding people from natural selection. We treat conditions that used to be fatal or prevent reproduction, so the underlying defective genotypes stick around and get passed on.
And the implication there, if Muller is right, is that these alleles, for everything from serious conditions down to things like, say, nearsightedness, which we easily fix with glasses, They aren't selected out. They just slowly build up in the population over time.
Exactly. We're changing our own evolutionary path just by being good at medicine.
Which leads us from these sort of unintentional consequences to where humans try to intentionally influence evolution. Let's talk about eugenics. It's a really loaded term.
It is. The term itself means good birth.
Mm.
It was coined by Francis Galton back in 1883. Galton was convinced that traits like intelligence were inherited. His initial idea was about improving the human gene pool through, well, judicious marriages, essentially selective breeding for desirable traits.
And that split into two paths, right? Positive and negative eugenics?
Yes. Positive eugenics was about increasing supposedly good genes. Galton's idea, or maybe like that campaign in Singapore in the 90s encouraging university graduates to have more kids. But the much more dominant and frankly much darker side was negative eugenics.
That focused on getting rid of harmful genes.
Yes, and it led to some truly horrific policies, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Compulsory sterilization, marriage restrictions, immigration bans based on origin, forced abortions. These movements were often deeply rooted in racist and classist biases, like using certain groups as a standard to judge others against. And ultimately, it led to genocide, like in Nazi Germany. It's a really stark warning about applying breeding ideas to people.
A very dark chapter. But the conversation today seems different. It's shifted away from those state programs towards individual choices, using modern medical tech.
That's right. Things like genetic counseling, prenatal testing, ultrasounds, various screening tests, and even screening embryos during IVF, pre-implantation screening. These are, in effect, forms of individual voluntary selection. And they are having measurable impacts on gene frequencies already.
Like the example from Taiwan with thalassemia?
Exactly. Thalassemia is a serious inherited blood disorder. Widespread prenatal screening was adopted there, and over just 8 years, the number of babies born with the condition dropped dramatically. That change was driven entirely by voluntary choices based on genetic information.
And looking ahead, there's gene therapy, directly fixing genes.
That's the potential future, yes. It's had some serious setbacks. There's a tragic death in a U.S. trial in 1999, and some kids in an XSCID trial developed cancer later. So there are risks. But research is definitely pushing forward. We're getting closer to being able to alter somatic cells, maybe even germline cells one day, which would bypass selection entirely.
Okay, let's shift gears now, away from how we influence our own evolution and towards how we've reshaped the evolution of pretty much everything else, starting with agriculture about 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, the Neolithic Revolution. Although it's funny, farming isn't uniquely human. Some ants have been farming fungi for like 50 million years. But human agriculture was transformative. People started cultivating plants independently in maybe 24 different places around the world.
And the pressure we put on those plants was intense, selecting for traits that were actually bad for the plant in the wild.
Totally. Like stopping seed shattering, making the plant hold onto its seeds until harvest instead of scattering them, and massively increasing the size of the seeds or fruits.
And this happened fast.
In evolutionary terms, incredibly fast.
Yeah.
Sometimes just 500 years or so for crops like rye to change dramatically under human selection. Just a few genes often controlled these big changes. Then, boom, another revolution in the 1970s. Genetic engineering with recombinant DNA.
This is different from just crossbreeding, like making triticale from wheat and rye.
Oh yeah, very different. Traditional breeding works within closely related species, but genetic modification using recombinant DNA lets you take a gene from, say, a bacterium or even a fish and put it into a plant. You use tools like restriction enzymes as sort of molecular scissors to cut DNA, and then things like plasmids act as tiny delivery trucks to get that new DNA into the host organism and copy it.
And the uptake of GMOs, genetically modified organisms, has been incredibly fast. The first one was a tomato, the Flav Sav, in '94.
That's right. And by 2009, GM crops covered a huge area worldwide, millions of square kilometers. The benefits were clear, things like built-in pest resistance, meaning less pesticide use, more enhanced nutrition, like golden rice with extra vitamin A precursor.
There was even that interesting side effect with corn.
Yeah, the finding that planting transgenic corn, the kind engineered to resist pests, could actually lower pest damage in nearby non-GM cornfields, basically because it knocks down the whole local pest population so much.
But obviously this tech brings big questions, ethical concerns, environmental ones.
Definitely. The main ethical sticking point for many is that idea of crossing major species barriers, putting an animal gene in a plant, for example. Though, from an evolutionary perspective, it's maybe worth noting that horizontal gene transfer genes moving between unrelated organisms via viruses, transposons, stuff like that, actually happens naturally quite a bit across the tree of life. It's not entirely unnatural.
Hmm. Interesting point. So maybe the environmental worries are more concrete.
They often focus on biodiversity. The main concern is genes escaping from the GM crop, maybe via pollen, into wild relatives or weeds. Could you create herbicide-resistant superweeds? Or alter the genetics of native plants? These are real possibilities that mean we need to be careful, especially since the tech is still relatively new in ecological time.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, our longer lives, our medical interventions, our farming, our sheer numbers, it leads to a pretty stark conclusion from the sources. Humans, through our technology, have become the world's dominant evolutionary force.
Yeah, that's the takeaway. And it even has an estimated economic cost. Things like antibiotic resistance in bacteria,
Hmm.
pests evolving resistant to pesticides. One figure puts the cost at over $50 billion a year just in the US.
And driving all this is our population size. Over 7 billion now, maybe heading to 9.5 billion by 2050, fueled by that longevity we talked about, but also plummeting infant mortality. It was maybe 15% in many places around 1900. Now it's often less than 1%.
And all those people have a huge ecological footprint. The resources we use, the waste we create, is putting immense pressure on the planet's resources. This isn't entirely new, of course.
Mm.
Our impact might go back to the extinction of large mammals, the megafauna, in the Paleolithic.
And we see it today everywhere, collapsing fish stocks like the northern cod you mentioned, invasive species wrecking ecosystems, think of chestnut blight in America, vital habitats like tropical seagrass beds disappearing. Basically, human activities, from manipulating genes to just paving land, are setting the selection pressures for almost every other species now.
Right. The synthesis here is that our cultural evolution, our technology, our medicine, our societies now dictates the biological evolution, the fate of ourselves, and countless other species. The sources kind of echo historical lessons. Societies that outstrip their local resources tend to collapse. The difference now is our local resources are basically the entire globe.
So the big picture is really striking. Human evolution is now mostly about rapid, self-directed change. Culture is driving biology. And we're not just tweaking our own gene pool, we're fundamentally reshaping the entire planet's genetic landscape.
Which leaves us with a really challenging final thought, something for you to ponder. Our power to engineer genomes is growing incredibly fast. So how will people in the future look back at the genes, the alleles, that we choose to preserve today? Not because they offer any real fitness in a natural sense, but simply because we developed the tech to keep them around, to sidestep selection.
That's a profound question for our evolutionary future. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into how our culture and our biology are now so deeply intertwined.